in his detailed reports, refers to various building activities of his own, among them water projects. Although we cannot be certain as to the exact nature of his building activities, these Moabite projects were built by a kingdom which was subjugated to Israel during the first half of the 9th century, after freeing itself from the Israelite yoke. We may therefore safely assume that Omride Israel was no less capable of similar projects. While the Aramean army posed a threat during the entire 9th century, sufficient resources and political strength existed in Israel only during the first half of that century. In the second half of the 9th century, Israel lost its holding in Moab and was subordinate to Aram. It is unlikely that Aram would have permitted Israel to build fortifications of this order, even if Israel could muster the necessary resources for such an ambitious project at this time. This evaluation rests first of all on the biblical description of the times of Yehu and Yoachaz, which portrays a distressed Israel totally subjugated to Aram with a small and weak army. Thus, according to the Deuteronomistic history, which had no reason to link distress to Yehu, who rooted out the Baal cult, as well as from the perspective of Amos, some 40 years later, who remembers the unceasing Aramean pressure of the inhabitants of the Gilad. This reconstruction is corroborated by archaeology. Tel Dan was taken by Chazael, who erected a victory stele in it. The expansion of Aram to Gat is apparent in the excavations of Aaron Meyer of Tel Safi, as we heard today, and this was beautifully illustrated. The inscription of Zakur, king of Hamat, is a testimony to Aram being the local ringleader. Thus, the position of Israel as a weak, inferior state under the Aramean dominion during the second half of the 9th century does not render likely the possibility that this was the time when the fortification system was initiated and executed. The Arameans were a significant power in the first half of the 9th century as well. Aram headed the anti-Assyrian coalition and withstood alone an Assyrian attack in 841. Although most commentators agree that the stories about the 3 battles of Achab with Ben-Hadad reflect events more relevant to the days of the dynasty of Yehu during the days of Yoachaz and Yoash, it is more than likely that the Arameans exercised their power against Israel during Achab's rule as well. While the details of the battle at Samaria, the one at Afek, and the last confrontation at Ramot Gilad, where Achab was said to have died, are likely anachronistic, the historiographic notion is correct and fits well with what we know about the political and economical situation. The 2 kingdoms, Aram and Israel, competed over the supremacy in the area and over the control of the lucrative trade passing through Transjordan and Gilad. Even though Achab was the partner of Hadad-ezer in the Battle of Karkar at 853, this does not rule out the most probable possibility that the 2 were enemies during some of the former 22 years of Achab's rule. This was the case in the days of his son, Yoram. He probably continued to send forces to the coalition of 12 kings facing Ashur, as Shalmaneser mentions his clashes with them again in 849, 848, and 845. On the other hand, Chazael, king of Aram, testified in the Tel Dan stele to his bitter struggle against Israel and Judah, which resulted in the death of the 2 kings, Yoram, king of Israel, and Achaziah, king of Judah. In his inscription, Chazael mentions a former attack of the Israelite king against his father's land, in line 4. Notwithstanding the question, who exactly was Chazael's father if he was an usurper, this is a valid indication of Israeli-Aramean hostilities prior to Chazael. The military abilities of Aram are well documented from the second half of the 9th century, especially in siege warfare. They had built a siege wall in Gat, the only one of its kind found in excavations today, and again I'm repeating what we heard from Aaron Meyer. And Zakur relates the military means of the coalition headed by Bar-Hadad, son of Chazael, to conquer the besieged capital city Hadrach. They had built a siege wall higher than the city's wall and dug a trench deeper than the city's trench. In the 2 biblical stories of an Aramean siege of Samaria, one in the days of Achab in 1 Kings 20, and one in the days of his son Yoram in 2 Kings 6-7, the biblical author attributed great military powers to Aram. It is especially significant to note the long-term siege in the days of Yoram. While the story does not state how long this siege lasted, it says that it brought about a great famine, accompanied with the two classic literary indications of extreme hunger, increase of prices of food, and cannibalism, women eating their own children. We may thus conclude that the Arameans were a threat during the Omride dynasty, but had managed to realize their potential in the full during the days of Hazael in the second half of the 9th century. In sum, the phenomenon of elaborated fortifications appearing in Israel and Judah was created against the Aramean threat. The developed phase of fortifications was created in a time of economic and political strength to answer the threat posed by the expansion policy of Aram. It was created during the Omride dynasty in the first half of the 9th century and not during the reign of Yehu and Yoachaz in the second half, when Israel was weak and subjugated to Aram. This reconstruction bears important consequences on the current debate on chronology of the Iron Age too. Since the elaborate fortification system were initiated during the first half of the 9th century, the urbanization process which preceded this developed stage of the appearance of fortification systems must have begun in the days prior to the Omride dynasty, namely in the 10th century or early 9th century at the latest. We thus suggest that forthcoming discussions of chronology address the issue of the enemy at the gates. Thank you.
We have a few minutes left before we conclude, and Dr. Wazana, Dr. Ben-Ami would be glad to take questions on the last paper. Or, yes, please.
Question about the two triangles on the jar handle. Anybody wants to relate that to Gilmore's article on the Asherah found in the city of David?
This is a question for you. The two triangles.
I didn't catch the second sentence.
There's a recent article by Garth Gilmore about the two triangles found in the city of David.
Yeah, I read it, yes.
Related to Asherah.
Yeah.
Is there a relationship?
No.
Exactly the same.
No, it's not exactly the same. It's very different.
Was there another hand that we saw there? Well, I think that we certainly this afternoon have gotten a very good picture of the 9th century and the Arameans, both in the first half and the second half of the century. And I thank you all, and especially our speakers, for their contributions.